Eastern State Penitentiary was once the most famous and expensive prison in the world, but stands today in ruin, a haunting world of crumbling cell blocks and empty guard towers. Known for its grand architecture and strict discipline, this was the world's first true penitentiary, a prison designed to inspire penitence, or true regret. Its vaulted, skylit cells once held many of America's most notorious lawbreakers, including bank robber, Slick Willie, Sutton and Al Capone. Alphonse Capone, Scarface, Chicago's most famous mob boss, spent 8 months at Eastern State from 1929 to 1930. Arrested for carrying a concealed, deadly weapon, this was Capone's first prison sentence. His time in Eastern State was spent in relative luxury. His cell on the Park Avenue block had fine furniture, oriental rugs, and a cabinet radio. Freda Frost. Female inmates were part of the landscape at Eastern State for almost 100 years, and Freda Frost was the last of them. Transferred to the Muncie Industrial Home for Women in 1923, Frost's departure marked the end of an era. Frost had been serving a 20-year sentence for murder. She had poisoned her husband. William Francis Slick Willie Sutton. One of the most famous bank robbers in American history, Slick Willie spent 11 years at Eastern State Penitentiary. In 1945, Sutton, along with 11 other prisoners, escaped from Eastern State in an inmate-dug tunnel that went almost 100 feet underground. Sutton was recaptured just minutes later. Over the course of his criminal career, Sutton is credited with over 50 bank robberies, 3 successful escapes from prison, and over 30 years served behind bars. He died in 1980. Conditions at the Walnut Street Jail, located directly behind Independence Hall, were appalling. Men and women, adults and children, thieves and murderers were jailed together in disease-ridden, dirty pens where rape and robbery were common occurrences. Jailers made little effort to protect the prisoners from each other. Instead, they sold the prisoners alcohol, up to nearly 20 gallons of it a day. Food, heat, and clothing came at a price. It wasn't unusual for prisoners to die from the cold or starvation. The inmates lived in complete isolation, with a Bible their only possession, and chores like shoemaking and weaving to occupy their time. The Eastern State Penitentiary instituted what was called the separate system, or the Pennsylvania system, to reform criminals. The controversial reformation method prevented criminals from speaking or experiencing human interaction for the length of their incarceration. For 23 hours a day, prisoners remained in their cells, forbidden to speak or receive any visitors besides their guards and local ministers. The forced isolation was intended to make prisoners reflect upon their wrongdoings and seek God in their solitude, but for many, the unending silence and loneliness lead to growing insanity. Although complete silence and no communication between inmates was enforced, there were prisoners who broke the rules, and the inmates were dealt harsh, inhumane punishments. Among the notorious tortures were the hole. The hole, an underground cell where no light, no human contact, and no toilets were allowed to prisoners, sometimes for weeks at a time. Very little food was offered, and what was provided was usually set upon by roaches and rats. The mad chair, where prisoners were confined for days, unable to move their bodies and so tightly bound that some later required amputations to limbs where circulation had been cut off. The water bath, a tortuous dunk into cold water that was followed by hanging the rule breaker from a prison wall all night long. During winter months, punished inmates could be found coated with a layer of frost when they were released from the wall in the morning. The iron gag, arguably the worst of the horrible punishments, which was administered by clamping an iron collar on a prisoner's tongue, strapping their arms behind their backs, and chaining the tongue collar to their wrists. Any movement instantly caused the tongue to start tearing and bleeding profusely, and inmates were known to die from blood loss. In 1833, only 4 years after it opened, Eastern State Penitentiary faced public scrutiny when inmate Matthias Macumsey met an untimely death after trying to communicate with another prisoner. Prison officials clamped him in the iron gag as punishment, and just 1 hour later found him dead in his cell. The official cause of death was apoplexy, and prison employees were cleared of any wrongdoing, but most people would maintain that the iron gag caused Macumsey's death, and the scandal began to chip away at Eastern State's reputation.
Originally, inmates were housed in cells that could only be accessed by entering through a small exercise yard attached to the back of the prison. Only a small portal, just large enough to pass meals, opened onto the cell blocks. This design proved impractical, and in the middle of construction, cells were constructed that allowed prisoners to enter and leave the cell blocks through metal doors that were covered by a heavy wooden door to filter out noise. The halls were designed to have the feel of a church. Some believe that the doors were small so prisoners would have a harder time getting out, minimizing an attack on an officer. Others have explained the small doors forced the prisoners to bow while entering their cell. This design is related to penance and ties to the religious inspiration of the prison. The cells were made of concrete with a single glass skylight, representing the eye of God, suggesting to the prisoners that God was always watching them.
The prison, which closed in 1971, is considered by several sources to be one of the most haunted places in America. It has been featured on the Travel Channel's Ghost Adventures and Most Haunted Live, Sci-Fi's Ghost Hunters and MTV's Fear. Dozens of paranormal researchers visit every year and report that it's a hub of otherworldly activity. Perhaps most convincingly, there are the stories of eerie experiences by visitors, staff, guards and inmates that have corroborated each other since the 1940s.
If you want to see more videos like this, please like and subscribe to the channel.